We are so excited that you are here as Director General, and the energy is absolutely palpable and clear that we have a great decade ahead to achieve the goal of FAO, and that is to end hunger. That is the mandate of SDG 2, and I'm going to share some thoughts about how, though arduous, this task can be accomplished. I hope that my PowerPoint can be put up so I can show a few numbers and graphs. There we are. Thank you very much. So I want to talk about ending food insecurity, a challenge that covers more than 2 billion people on the planet, as you know, and FAO provides us the definitive data each year. And if we count those who are also suffering from obesity, which is also a food sector challenge, we have 4 billion of the nearly 8 billion people on the planet that are malnourished in one way or another, whether it is the extreme food insecurity, whether it is the so-called moderate food insecurity or micronutrient deficiencies, or whether it is the bad diets that have resulted from a food industry which serves us unhealthy food. We have a major challenge in enabling nearly 8 billion people to feed themselves nutritiously and well day to day. And this is our lead organization in the world for accomplishing that. It's an organization of remarkable skill and knowledge, and let me say happy birthday to FAO today as well. If you think about the Sustainable Development Goals, all 17, it is true to say that FAO is deeply involved in every single one of them, because FAO is involved in our health, it is involved in public education, it is involved in fighting poverty, it is involved in gender equality, where so many of the world's smallholder farmers are women, and so many women are the ones that put food on the table all over the world. It is involved in the issue of water, obviously, SDG 6, with 70% of the consumptive water use in the planet going to agriculture itself. It's fundamentally engaged with land use issues and therefore with renewable energy, SDG 7, with decent work, given the hundreds of millions of people whose livelihoods depend on agriculture, on SDG 9, infrastructure, which is absolutely central to my topic today, on reducing inequalities of income and wealth, SDG 10. Every one of these goals is fundamentally at play in this organization. And I think that this gives obviously a tremendous amount of homework ahead and a tremendous amount of responsibility, but take pride in being at the very center of our globally agreed agenda for sustainable development. The agenda is not simple, however, and perhaps my main theme is the importance of FAO forging partnerships across sectors, across stakeholders, and across UN agencies. I am very proud to have been involved every day of the last 20 years with the United Nations system. We depend on it for our very survival. The UN agencies are the crucial institutions that keep our world safe, that keep our world fed, and that keep our world from blowing ourselves up. And we need to partner strongly within the UN system. One of the main points that I'll be emphasizing is that FAO has a strong partnership role to play with almost every other major UN agency in order to accomplish its own work and to accomplish the Sustainable Development Goals. So, FAO is the lead UN institution for ending hunger. It is the lead UN institution for sustainable agriculture. It is the lead institution, in fact, for managing the biological storage of carbon, which is fundamental for solving the climate crisis. And agriculture, as you know, is the #1 driver of environmental change on the planet. It is the lead contributor to greenhouse gas emissions, surprisingly. Bigger than cars and trucks and transport, bigger than the power sector. Agriculture is at the very heart of solving the climate change crisis, and it is indeed an urgent crisis that is getting more and more urgent. And agriculture gets it in both ways. It's both a major, indeed the largest single contributor to anthropogenic climate change, and it is certainly the sector most vulnerable to climate change. We have already entered an era of food production instability because of the extreme climate events that are occurring with increasing frequency and increasing intensity. FAO also is absolutely central to the task of ending extreme poverty, because about 70% of the world's poor are rural, overwhelmingly engaged or linked to the agriculture sector. So productive, remunerative agriculture is essential. It's not the sole pathway, but it is essential to ending extreme poverty. And as I've explained, health, education, and the other SDG challenges as well. But the core focus of this institution since its inception, of course, has been on ending hunger and food security. And I want to spend most of my remarks on this challenge. We know we are not in good shape. The data are not really all that welcoming in this year's report. We have not only leveled off in progress in reducing hunger, but we've seen the numbers of those in extreme and moderate food insecurity rise in recent years. There are two overwhelming geographic concentrations, though, throughout this room, and including in my own country, the United States, there's a lot of hunger. But the highest concentrations of hunger in the world are in two regions, and it behooves us to understand the challenges in those regions. About 70 to 75% of the world's concentrated extreme hunger and moderate to severe food insecurity is in sub-Saharan Africa and in South Asia. And they each have, of course, their strong and distinct challenges, but solving the challenges in these two regions will overwhelmingly address this challenge globally. And to put it another way, it is within Africa and within South Asia that the rise of hunger and food insecurity has occurred during the past decade. These are two very, very challenging parts of the world, and there is a lot of extreme suffering underway, and there is a tremendous vulnerability to climate change in both regions as well. So we have to hurry on all fronts, and nothing should stop us from putting the end of human-induced climate change as our highest priority, because if we do not control anthropogenic climate change, we cannot achieve anything else of the SDGs for the long term. We will absolutely wreck the planet unless we get anthropogenic climate change under control. So if you look, as you know, I'm just reporting from your report, the numbers are on the rise. We have had more than 100 million people in recent years added to those suffering from severe food insecurity. We have had more than 300 million increase in those suffering from moderate or severe food insecurity since 2014. I do expect that when we review these numbers by 2030, these numbers will be near zero. I really don't doubt it, by the way. And your Director General's country has proved that it can be done, and it can be done in short order. China ended poverty this year, a country that had more than 80% poverty in 1980, and it has made strides that have shown the rest of the world what can be accomplished with directed efforts and especially with large-scale, well-designed investments. And that has to be the theme for achieving the goals that are before us. It is important to understand, of course, that ending food insecurity does not mean simply something within the farms or growing more food, as important as that may be, or raising the incomes of smallholder farmers, as important that that may be. Food insecurity, of course, is about much more than the food sector. It is broadly about economic development and the escape from extreme poverty. And one of the important tables in your report this year shows the powerful correlation of food insecurity with three line items that I want to point out. One is GDP per capita. Countries that are poor are countries that are food insecure. It makes sense. Households with adequate income can purchase the food for food security. Food security and income poverty are two sides of the same phenomenon by and large. Of course, food enters the equation because many of the extreme poor are farmers. So if they were more productive or growing more food or selling more high-value products, they would be out of poverty and providing more for the market. But poverty and hunger are virtually the same phenomenon. After all, the correlation coefficient is minus 0.83. That is a very tight fit between income per capita and food insecurity. But an even stronger correlation is with the World Bank's Human Capital Index. And this, I want to emphasize, the absolute prerequisite for escaping from both poverty and hunger is human health and skills, period. Young people with an education, with decent training, and with physical health will not be poor. Children that don't get an education will be poor almost surely, no matter what efforts we do. And start with the proposition that is shocking to me, that 260 million school-age kids are out of school right now. What kind of world are we that isn't the #1 objective of our politicians around the world, to get the kids in school? There is no more basic investment in this world than in our children, in their safe birth, in their early nutrition, in their health, and then in their schooling. And societies that can accomplish that are societies that will accomplish everything else. Because with healthy and well-educated young people, there is no limit now. But we have 260 million kids not even in a school. That's SDG 4. You know, in sub-Saharan Africa, the highest concentration of extreme poverty and hunger, only 20% of the kids are finishing upper secondary education. Why is this, by the way? It's not for lack of trying. It's not for lack of interest. It's not because the fathers don't want their daughters educated. It's not because the governments are corrupt. It is because of poverty, because it costs money to have a child educated for a year. At a minimum, UNESCO estimates it costs about $400 per child. But $400 per child means about $150 for all the children in a per capita sense. A country would have to spend about $150 per capita to educate its children in the budget. But think of a country, Burkina Faso, in the room, $700 per capita income. $150 is more than the entire budget of the country. And so there's no way to educate the children out of the national budget, no matter how hard it comes. But that's where the rich world was supposed to stand up and have some sense and say, oh, we need some funding for the children in your country, madam. And the rich countries are supposed to say, how can we help you? Not how can we run away from our responsibilities. So I want to emphasize that the task in front of us is about the broad task of ending poverty, educating children, ensuring their health, because that's how we're going to end hunger. Within that will come specific areas in agriculture, in rural development, of course. But the rural development needs its schools, it needs its clinics, it needs its safe delivery, it needs its care, and it needs the responsibility of the rich world, which unfortunately is not fully reflected. Health expenditures per capita are correlated with food insecurity, also with a coefficient of -0.83. Those who cannot afford basic health will also have a population in hunger. So ending food insecurity requires overall economic development, and it requires a robust food sector also that sustainably provides nutritious foods and overwhelmingly from local food supply. It is a dual task, and FAO is in the lead with the partner institutions, IFAD and the World Food Program, on the second of these challenges. But all of us have to work closely together on the first of these challenges, the overall economic development. Let me turn to the challenge specifically in one of these two highly concentrated hunger regions. I'll say a few words about South Asia afterwards. But let me turn to the challenge of sub-Saharan Africa, because it is the biggest challenge in fighting extreme poverty, in fighting hunger, and in achieving the rest of the Sustainable Development Goals, notably SDG 3 on basic health and SDG 4 on education. What is needed to end poverty is, in a way, rather well known. And again, I would take a country and a continent and a civilization at the same size as Africa's population, China, which accomplished this over the last 40 years. Accomplished the end of poverty from a poverty rate far higher than Africa has today. And it did it through a marvelous system of public planning and market institutions combined. What I believe Africa needs is first integrated wide planning. And I want to stress that we will not solve the problem of hunger anywhere in the world or in the African countries unless we are thinking at a regional scale. You know, the colonial powers divided the African continent into 54 separate countries. But the population of Africa is the same size as the population of China and the same size as the population of India. But one has 54 countries because that's where the lines were drawn in 1885 in Berlin and then in the 1950s. That's hard to solve this problem 54 separate times. This problem needs to be solved at a scale that makes sense, and that is the scale of the African Union. Fortunately, there is an organizational base for solving this problem now. So the first point I would emphasize is integrated Africa-wide planning and investment strategies. These would include investments in two fundamentally important areas: human capital, that means investing in education and in health, and in infrastructure, especially rail, power, and information technology. And I was very happy to see that the new China-supported rail from Nairobi to Naivasha opened today, actually, and it also connects with the line to Mombasa. And so rail is being built, and this is vital for freight on a continent as large as Africa. You cannot integrate the African continent without large-scale rail. And so this is a fundamentally important investment. And then finally, crucially important for Africa's future will be its demographic transition, both in terms of population dynamics and in terms of urbanization. And I'll come back to say a word about that in a moment. So consider the map. Those are the 54 countries in Africa compared to what was one subcontinent of South Asia, but again, because of the colonial period and its aftermath, it ended up as several countries. That's part of South Asia's big complication right now, and China. And I want to make the comparison of the three. Just to give you a baseline, Africa is not educating its children. It can't afford to, by and large. It's outside of the budget means, and our development assistance for education is meager, shocking, unbelievable, actually. It's the biggest question mark in my mind about our international system, because health spending is funded internationally, probably at this point at least 3 times more than education. And the education crisis is dramatic. Africa is graduating, as I said, about 20% of its kids with a high school degree. And there's no future possible unless that is rectified. It is the goal of SDG 4, remember, that every child should complete upper secondary education. Let's make that a core commitment for us for the next 10 years. It's absolutely vital to the challenge of ending poverty and ending hunger as well. Similarly, with health expenditures, while there has been some development aid, poverty is poverty. It costs at least $120 per person to run a basic primary health system. But $120 per person is, as I pointed out, maybe 3/4 of the total budget of a low-income country, of the total budgetary spending, therefore impossible. In other words, healthcare also depends on development aid. As much as we like to close our eyes to that fact, children will die without more development aid. This year, how many children will die under the age of 5? 5 million children. As David Beasley told us just a few minutes ago, they are dying of completely preventable and treatable causes. 5 million kids. It used to be 13 million under the age of 5 in 1990. We have made progress, but we could end 5 million deaths next year if the financing were adequate. How much is needed? Probably another $50 billion a year from the rich world to the poor world. That's 1/10 of 1% of the income of the rich world. It's 1/14 of the Pentagon budget, to give another number. We could do something if we wanted. But we don't try hard enough, because it's all known how to do this. It's not a mystery of having a safe childbirth. It's not a mystery of giving immunizations. It's not a mystery of tracking a child's health or giving an 80-cent dose of artemisinin in combination therapy in case of a malaria-infected bite of a mosquito. There's no mystery in it. It just costs a little money. And poor countries don't have it, and the result is poverty and the result is hunger. Now, let me turn to structural investments. And I'd like our Director General also to regard this, because this is so critical. China built a rail network, a fast rail, in the last 30 years, tens of thousands of kilometers. The most extensive fast rail system in the world, a remarkable accomplishment. Look at the rail of Africa right now. It is a few lines that were made by colonial powers to go from gold and diamond mines to ports. That's what the rail system is. And once the mines and the plantations had their rail, no more grid was built. So Africa can't physically trade within Africa with this kind of grid. Compare India and China, each with about 1.4 billion people, and Africa with 1.4 billion people. This is what we're facing if we want real economic development. And this is one of our tasks in the coming decade, to build out the transport network that makes it possible to escape from poverty. And by the way, is crucial for the farmers too, because farm produce has to move by freight. I mean, it's heavy freight. Trucks can do some, rail can do some, but both the highway network and the rail network hardly exist. Of course, another core feature of infrastructure is electricity. We know that in rural areas of Africa, there is not electricity. So this is the night lights. Look at China, look at India, look at Africa. Now, the good news is that with the dramatic decline of costs of solar energy that is now at parity with fossil fuels, there is nothing that prevents a dramatic electrification across Africa in the coming 10 years. So that's another challenge for us. Look at the internet use, because we know that to escape poverty, to escape hunger, and to have a modern economy, we need internet-provided value chains, supply chains, farmers that are on the internet, and so forth. Again, we face really a crisis, but here, once again, there is nothing that a little money wouldn't solve to actually provide the basic infrastructure that would enable a dramatic increase of economic development. Now, let me talk about the demography, because there is a real challenge here. Oops, and I did not label that chart properly, but the fast-growing line that starts the lowest and rises to the highest is Africa's population, sub-Saharan Africa. Of course, the data for after 2019 are projections by the United Nations Population Division. It's the so-called medium fertility projection. What this shows is that the medium fertility projection is that Africa would reach 4 billion people by 2100. At the same time, China will, which is the yellow line, will actually have a peak population around 2030 and then begin to decline and have a population of around 1 billion by 2100 from 1.4 billion today. South Asia, or India, which is shown here, will become the largest population single economy by overtaking China around 2030, or actually even earlier. And it too will peak around 2060 and end up with the end of the century, according to this forecast, at about 1.5 billion. Now, the point I want to make is the following. If Africa stays on this demographic trajectory, it is impossible to end hunger, and it is impossible to end poverty. Because not only will those numbers run far ahead of any infrastructure imaginable and any public services imaginable, but the pressures on the physical land will be impossible, especially in an era of climate change. Now, why is the fertility rate still so high at 4.8? There's one overwhelming reason, ladies and gentlemen, overwhelming, and that is that the girls are not enabled to stay in school. This is absolutely the central message of all recent demographic history. Educate girls, fertility rates come down, women enter the labor force. That's true across every country, every religion. This is so basic. So where are we, ladies and gentlemen, in not enabling the kids to stay in school? Because this absolutely is the #1 barrier that we face to everything. The UN has 3 forecasts. They're not really forecasts, they're scenarios. There's a high fertility scenario, a medium fertility scenario, and a low fertility scenario. That's what's shown here. At the low fertility scenario, Africa's population will not reach 4 billion, it will reach about 2.7 billion at the end of the century. It could even end up lower than that if we simply took upon us as a global community to ensure universal secondary school completion for all children in the world, the most basic standard of decency I can imagine on this planet, a cost that is unimaginably tiny, by the way, and then we would overcome these massive demographic pressures, and we would overcome them with remarkable rapidity. Let me give you one more example of how easy it would be to finance this. There are 15 people in the world, ladies and gentlemen, just 15, whose combined net worth is $1 trillion. Can I say that again? Think about it. 15 people have $1 trillion in their bank account this morning. Mr. Bezos is #1. Bill Gates is #2. I think Warren Buffett is #3 this morning. Mark Zuckerberg, #4. Mark Zuckerberg, he was on the dorm of my daughter. Now look. He's got $75 billion in his bank account or so this morning. 15 people. Now, it's usually said at universities like mine that if you make an endowment, you get a 5% payout rate. So 15 people have $1 trillion. Their endowment, their payout rate is just $50 billion a year. Do you know $50 billion a year would get every single child on this planet through upper secondary education? So it's just 15 people. So if you have Mark Zuckerberg's current email address, please let him know. Because we need to get this done. The other major demographic transition, and I want to emphasize this at FAO, is urbanization. The goal of better farming never is, in my view, to, quote, help keep people stay in the countryside. All of economic history says the higher the agricultural productivity, the faster the migration to the cities. That is how it has worked everywhere. In my country, in David's country, the United States, less than 1% of the workforce feeds the entire country because the agriculture is so productive. And that's what will happen with more productive agriculture. That's what's happening in China, for example, which is the blue line at the top. Starting in the 1980s, urbanization rates in China began to soar. China is now a predominantly urban society. It will become an overwhelmingly urban society, reaching 80% urbanization or so by mid-century. Africa is the most rural population. What I show here is for Eastern Africa, which is still around 30% urban, 70% rural. As agriculture becomes more productive, and as cities become more productive and integrated into global trade, urbanization in Africa will and must accelerate. It's core to escaping from poverty. There is no way to add another billion people into the African countryside except in poverty. And the cost of all services is far higher in the rural areas than in the urban areas, because in urban areas, people are concentrated. You can provide healthcare, education, power grid, water and sanitation at much, much lower costs. But the point I want to make is that always think of your challenge in the rural area as integrally connected with the challenge of urban development, because Africa's rural development will fail unless the urban development succeeds. That's true of any country. You need to base development on both poles of growth: higher agricultural productivity and higher productivity and growth of the urban economy. And then the urban economy will create jobs, and the rural economy will lose jobs as agricultural productivity rises, because a smaller and smaller percentage of the population will feed the whole country until it's well under 10% of the population. And history shows that for every job outside of agriculture, those jobs are most productive in the urban areas with face-to-face contact and better infrastructure. That's why services flock to the urban areas, why the financial sector flocks to the urban areas, why media are in the urban areas. And so expect and cultivate rapid urbanization. Don't think that this is about making the rural areas be able to absorb more and more population. Think about this as a complementary development strategy that is both rural and urban to end hunger. Now, in addition to the general development challenges, are the specific challenges of the food sector itself, where you are in the lead. And the food sector is absolutely crucial for every dimension of what I've just discussed. It's obviously crucial for ending poverty because so many of the poor are farmers today. It's crucial for providing nutritious diets for a population, and both caloric production and the quality and variety of foods needs to rise in the hungry areas, because not only is the total food output not sufficient, but also the diversity is typically insufficient, with a lot of micronutrient deficiencies as well. So these are areas you know extremely well, but I just want to highlight them: closing the yield gap, creating sustainable value chains, because the wastage, the losses, I should say, from agriculture, the value added that can be added for farm incomes depends entirely on creating these value chains, and the Director General is one of the most experienced world experts in proving that, and the need to farm while ending deforestation and other environmental degradation. Farms create environmental harms unless there's conscious, sustainable policies. One crucial thing, of course, is to move from using fuel wood for energy to using electricity. This is obvious. This is the shift from cutting down the trees and cutting down the vegetation to photovoltaics, which is the first order of business on the energy front. You know these data very well, but I just highlight that the there are huge productivity gaps in African agriculture. And the reason is very clear. The inputs are not used and are often not economically feasible to be used, partly because the conditions of transport and infrastructure are so inadequate. When farmers don't use fertilizer, they get yields that are a small fraction of the potential. And African fertilizer use is a tiny fraction of what it should be. And the result is poverty, very low yields, and a chronic yield gap. Infrastructure, training, and supply chains are the way to overcome that, because farmers will make more money, they will be producing higher value products, they will be getting the fertilizer at much lower cost, and they will be getting higher value for their outputs if we can get the infrastructure problems solved and if we can get the value chains better created. I recently, together with my colleagues at the Columbia Center on Sustainable Investment, completed a project on the coffee sector, which is an important sector for African agriculture, after all. One of the things that we found, which one should know, is that productivity in African coffee growing is completely stagnant. There has been no rise in coffee output per hectare for 30 years. But look at the difference with Vietnam and Brazil, which have had significant rises of productivity, of output per hectare during the past 30 years. What's the difference? Well, at a superficial level, the difference is inputs. Both Brazil and Vietnam use better seed varieties, they use more fertilizer, they use more irrigation, and so on. But what's the deeper point? The deeper point is that in both Brazil and in Vietnam, there is much more effective commercialization, much better infrastructure, and there is science, 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 which has helped the farmers to grow more productive coffee crops. And this is also missing in the African context, where the yields in Ethiopia, you can see, are maybe a fourth or a fifth of the yields that are now being achieved in Brazil for the same Arabica, the Arabica coffee. And on the sustainability side, I won't go into length because you know these facts, but in the so-called planetary boundary framework, the need to live within environmental constraints, agriculture is the major aggravant of every single planetary boundary at risk right now. It is the main contributor of greenhouse gases and climate change. It is, of course, the main contributor to the nitrogen flux and phosphorus flux, because fertilizer use needs to be improved and properly managed. It is the main driver of over-abstraction of fresh water. It is the main driver of deforestation and of biodiversity loss. And it is a major contributor, especially through burning, through forest fires, and through burning of croplands, of particulate pollution, which is also killing millions of people per year. So when we think about the improved inputs and think about the improved farm methods, now we have to make sure that this is also consistent with staying within the planetary boundaries. The UN group that I lead, the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, is, of course, very keen to support FAO and its leadership in any way. We recently have launched a project which we call FABLE, which is food, agriculture, biodiversity, land use, and energy, to try to get that holistic approach to environmental sustainability in the farm sector. Finally, let me turn to partnerships, because I've talked about the whole SDG agenda. and it's daunting. And FAO is involved with all of it, but FAO could not possibly solve all of these problems or even lead all of these problem areas. The need for partnerships is absolutely essential now, and building high-level strategic partnerships with the funding behind them is crucial. I give one example. In our coffee report, we have said to the major coffee roaster retailers, the industry is dominated by two big companies right now, by Nestle's and by JAB Holding. Our report says to them, you need to step forward. Your sector is under threat. Your sector is not sustainable. And yet you two companies are marketing half of the total coffee production of the world. Where are you? You can't just make money. You have to invest in sustainability. So it's important to name names of the companies. It's important to say you can't run from this problem. You're not just a buyer or a retailer. You are the lead value added in this sector. But there are tens of millions of people depending on your earnings being reinvested back into sustainable coffee. And I see the Columbia delegates shaking their, applauding. And I do stop at Juan Valdez Coffee on my walk to the UN from the Upper West Side each day. And this was promoted very much by the Colombian government. You should know, President Duque was at the launch of our report at the United Nations, Madam First Lady, in just a few days ago during the General Assembly. But what we're saying in the coffee sector is we need to bring the UN agencies in. FAO needs to help on the science of high productivity coffee. Nestle, JAB, and others need to help finance the way forward. We need national governments, we call for coffee sustainability strategies, because these are particular regions within the coffee growing countries, and they need strategies of infrastructure. And we need donor funding for the schools and the clinics and the water and the photovoltaics that make these communities viable. And so it is a package deal. It is a holistic approach that we need to develop. Oops. And we also launched at the UN a couple of weeks ago with the Barilla Company and the Barilla Center for Food and Nutrition a call on the food industry for responsibility, for sustainable development responsibility. We need the whole food sector engaged and knowing the SDGs mean them as well. Not just the UN, not just the donors, not just the billions of people whose lives literally depend on it, but some of the biggest name companies in the world. So we launched a report called Fixing the Business of Food, and we asked all companies to report on the following 4 points. First, does your company contribute to healthy and sustainable diets? If you're producing fast food, the answer is probably no. Not fast, ultra-processed food, you're probably contributing to the worldwide obesity epidemic. And that won't stand anymore. We can't have the food sector killing us. We have to have the food sector feeding us. And that means healthy products. And the big companies are not producing healthy products. They're producing junk food and saying it's not our responsibility. But we are in an epidemic now of obesity. And that is because of ultra-processed foods. And this has to end. There needs to be corporate responsibility. Second, are the company's production processes sustainable? The way companies produce. You have to report on it in our view. Third, are the company's supply chains sustainable? Let me make this point. If you are Kraft Heinz, if you're a big international buyer and you're buying food from Brazil right now, and that food is coming from the Amazon, and it's coming from a region which is under deforestation, that is not acceptable. We cannot have international trade exacerbating the environmental crises. So I think we need co-responsibility in the supply chains. A company can't say, I just buy it, I didn't make it. This can't work in our world. We'll never have environmental sustainability that way. So we call on companies to report on their supply chains and to insist that their supply chain should be sustainable in upstream supply. And finally, is the company a good corporate citizen? I have one big criterion on that. Do you pay your taxes? Because we have a completely rigged international system. Rigged. Where the big companies end up making their profits, lo and behold, in a little tax haven someplace where they don't even have an office. But some of the biggest companies in the world end up putting their profits into some of the smallest places in the world that's actually just an electronic ledger that is a vehicle for tax evasion. Well, if there is this tax evasion, and it's hundreds of billions of dollars a year, ladies and gentlemen, hundreds of billions, which is taking money from the poorest countries and putting it into the tax havens, we have to stop that as well. We're going to be working with the General Assembly this year to try to get global action on tax honesty. It's been too long in the hands of the powerful countries. And believe me, just one word about that. They know what they're doing. I live in New York. That's how the law firms make a business, helping their companies to hide their money. This is not a valid business. It has to end because you, ladies and gentlemen, need the revenues in your budget so your children can go to school. So this is the fourth point of company responsibility that I want to highlight. So the point, and I will, one more. Finally, just to mention, FAO, we're thrilled with your leadership, thrilled that you're going to lead together with World Food Program and with IFAD the end of food insecurity, the end of hunger in the coming decade. It will happen. To do it, let's forge strong partnerships across the UN leadership. On nutrition and universal health coverage, FAO and WHO will be great partners. To say that in all the poor farm regions, where's the health care? To make sure that the health coverage is actually delivered. To make sure that the nutrition is fully monitored. On universal education, UNESCO has the lead of the UN system. I was with the Director General, Madame Azoulay, last week. They are dramatically stepping up their efforts on universal education, SDG 4. This is another wonderful partnership for FAO. On ensuring solar rural energy, we have the Green Climate Fund, based in Incheon, Korea, created under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. Let's get electricity to the world's smallholder farmers so that there can be electric pumps, so that there can be processing, so that there can be food storage. This is why the Green Climate Fund was created. But they need to know what to do with their money, so I think FAO could give some wonderful suggestions to the Green Climate Fund and to the member countries of the Green Climate Fund. The International Monetary Fund is responsible for finances, for overseeing budget processes in the world. I've worked with the Fiscal Affairs Department this past year to look at how budgets are or are not aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals. The findings are very clear to the IMF. We need more money from international donors and from tax reform coming into the budgets of the poor countries. We can get the IMF working together with the poor countries and with FAO to say we need more budget revenues to carry out the fight against hunger. And I want to make that connection strongly. The new managing director of the IMF, Kristalina Georgieva, is absolutely wonderful, committed to the SDGs, and we have a very strong ability to have a partnership with the IMF. On internet connectivity, the Director General is telling us every day we need smart supply chains. We need farmers online. We need the applications. That's how Chinese farmers have gone from poverty to wealth, because they're part of sophisticated supply chains. That requires connectivity. We have in the UN the ITU UNESCO Broadband Commission. I'm a commissioner on that commission. They're responsible for achieving, from the UN's perspective, universal ICT connectivity. Let's get them on the case. We need connectivity in the rural areas for the farm sector, because this, I think, is a challenge that they would take on. Of course, we have the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Global Environment Facility, and IUCN as our three main institutions on biodiversity conservation. Next year in Kunming, China will host COP15 of the Convention on Biological Diversity. It's an absolutely essential meeting to ensure that we step up in the 2020s to stop what IPBES just reported as a devastating loss of biodiversity underway on the planet. Again, FAO has a huge role to play because we need farming to be sustainable. And so I believe that there's a great opportunity here. And then finally, ladies and gentlemen, as I've been emphasizing, the global food industry has been making a lot of money. It's very big, it's very powerful. They need to be partners in sustainable development. They can be partners with FAO, but they need to behave and to report and to be accountable for their sustainability. So I think that this is another crucial partnership to make. Let me conclude by saying how confident I am that we will see a decade of progress. Because, ladies and gentlemen, there is no problem that we face for which solutions have not been identified, often for many, many years. But we have been underinvesting in those solutions because the poor are very poor, so as many times as one lectures the poor, they don't have the money to solve the problem. But we have a commitment to global solidarity. We have a rich world. Remember, whenever you want to ask how big is a number, the world production this year will be $100 trillion. Or just think of the 15 nice individuals with $1 trillion in their bank account. We've got the wealth to do it. We just need now a little bit of coordination and motivation. We certainly have the leadership to do it. Thank you very much.